In 1987, during the democratic uprising that would topple South Korea's military dictatorship, protesters broke into the abandoned Hannam-dong compound that had once served as Samsung founder Lee Byung-chul's private residence. Behind a hidden wall in what had been the industrial patriarch's study, they discovered a climate-controlled vault containing thousands of documents that revealed the true foundation of Korea's economic miracle. A legacy built not on entrepreneurial innovation and hard work, but on systematic collaboration with fascist occupiers, the brutal suppression of labor movements, and the systematic corruption of democratic institutions through methods that would have impressed the most ruthless dictators in history. For decades, the South Korean public had celebrated the Samsung name as synonymous with national pride and economic achievement, believing they were witnessing the triumph of Korean ingenuity over poverty and foreign domination. The documents in that hidden vault told a different story. How Lee Byung-chul had collaborated with Japanese colonial authorities to identify Korean independence activists for execution. How Samsung's early profits came from slave labor operations that killed thousands of Korean workers. And how the company had systematically corrupted every level of Korean society, while maintaining private armies that eliminated anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. Most disturbing of all were the detailed records Lee had kept of what he privately called patriotic eliminations. Comprehensive lists of labor organizers, democratic activists, and journalists who had been systematically murdered when they discovered evidence of Samsung's criminal activities. These files documented how industrial accidents had been used to eliminate inconvenient witnesses, how entire villages had been relocated or destroyed to make way for Samsung facilities, and how the company had developed assassination techniques so sophisticated that they had eliminated hundreds of potential threats while maintaining the facade of legitimate business operations. The vault also contained evidence that many of South Korea's most celebrated industrial achievements, factories that had allegedly demonstrated Korean economic progress, had actually been built through systematic slave labor operations that killed workers at rates that exceeded those of wartime concentration camps. Construction projects that were supposedly symbols of national development had been completed through methods that violated every principle of human decency, while generating enormous profits that were hidden in Swiss bank accounts and international investment schemes. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was documentation proving that the Lee family had developed a network of political corruption so comprehensive that they effectively controlled the South Korean government through bribery, blackmail, and assassination operations that eliminated any official who threatened their industrial empire. Presidents, judges, military commanders, and bureaucrats had all been systematically compromised through Samsung's intelligence operations, while the company operated above the law through methods that made a mockery of democratic institutions and constitutional protections. The mansion that housed these horrors sat on 50 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds in Seoul's exclusive Hannam-dong district, surrounded by the diplomatic residences and luxury estates of Korea's industrial elite, whose fortunes had been built through similar methods of systematic oppression disguised as economic development. From the outside, the traditional Korean Hanok architecture appeared to represent nothing more than the elegant residence of Korea's most successful entrepreneur. In reality, it served as the headquarters for the most comprehensive corruption network in East Asian history, and the planning center for operations that had shaped Korean society through systematic violence and exploitation. The discovery of these documents should have triggered the largest investigation into industrial crime in Korean history. Instead, the vault's contents were quickly confiscated by representatives of major chaebols and government officials, who worked together to ensure that the evidence would never see the light of day. The protesters who had found the vault were arrested and charged with terrorism, while the documents themselves disappeared into classified archives where they remain hidden to this day. The cover-up succeeded so completely that most Koreans continued to view Samsung as a symbol of national success and technological progress. But those who worked within Korea's industrial establishment understood that they had witnessed something far more sinister: the systematic transformation of an entire nation into a corporate feudal state where human beings existed solely to generate profits for industrial families who treated their fellow citizens as disposable resources in the pursuit of wealth and power. Lee Byung-chul had died just months before the democratic uprising, taking with him the secrets of how he had built Samsung into Korea's most powerful chaebol through systematic collaboration with foreign occupiers, the brutal exploitation of Korean workers, and corruption so comprehensive that it had turned the Korean government into a wholly owned subsidiary of his industrial empire. But the criminal network he had created survived his death, continuing to shape Korean society while ensuring that evidence of systematic crimes against the Korean people would never be exposed to democratic accountability. But to understand how Lee Byung-chul came to wield such absolute power over Korean society, and why he felt the need to maintain a private intelligence network that eliminated anyone who threatened to expose the true cost of Korea's industrial development, we must travel back to the rice fields of Gyeongnam Province, where a young man first learned that survival under foreign occupation required the systematic betrayal of his own people. Colonial Origins, the story of Samsung's systematic oppression of the Korean people, begins not with the elegant Hannam-dong mansion that would one day house evidence of industrial crimes, but with the birth of Lee Byung-chul on February 12, 1910, in the village of Ueryong in Gyeongsangnam Province. His father, Lee Chan-woo, was a small landowner who had managed to maintain his property holdings during the early years of Japanese colonial rule, while his mother, Kwon Yi-rim, came from a family of minor Confucian scholars who had quickly adapted to serving the new colonial administration. From his earliest years, young Lee displayed a combination of ruthless pragmatism and complete absence of loyalty to Korean national interests that would define his approach to business throughout his career. At age 8, he was already collaborating with Japanese colonial officials to identify Korean families who were hiding rice supplies from government requisition programs, earning small rewards while watching his neighbors suffer from malnutrition caused by systematic food confiscation policies. His childhood was marked by his family's systematic collaboration with Japanese colonial authorities, as his father had discovered that survival and prosperity required complete submission to foreign rule, while demonstrating unwavering loyalty to policies designed to destroy Korean cultural identity and economic independence. Young Lee observed how collaboration could be converted into privilege, while resistance led to imprisonment, torture, and execution of entire families. The most formative experience of Lee's youth occurred when he was 12 years old and witnessed the systematic destruction of a neighboring village, whose residents had refused to provide forced labor for a Japanese industrial project. Rather than feel horror at the violence inflicted on fellow Koreans, Lee understood that he was learning valuable lessons about the relationship between power and survival in a colonial society where Korean lives were considered disposable resources in the service of Japanese imperial objectives. The village's elimination was conducted with systematic efficiency that impressed young Lee with its organizational sophistication and complete disregard for Korean welfare. Japanese military personnel had surrounded the settlement during the night, preventing escape, while soldiers systematically murdered residents and burned buildings to eliminate any evidence of Korean resistance to colonial policies. The survivors were transported to forced labor camps where they died from overwork, malnutrition, and disease, while their children were sent to institutions that would indoctrinate them into loyal service to Japanese imperialism. Rather than develop sympathy for the victims of this colonial violence, Lee began studying the methods that Japanese authorities used to identify and eliminate resistance, while rewarding collaboration with improved social status and economic opportunities. He understood that success in colonial Korea required not just submission to foreign rule, but active participation in the oppression of fellow Koreans who threatened the stability that collaboration could provide. His formal education at Waseda University in Tokyo from 1930 to 1936 provided Lee with exposure to Japanese business methods and imperial ideology, while teaching him to view Korean society as raw material that could be exploited for the benefit of more advanced civilizations. But perhaps more importantly, his time in Japan introduced him to the systematic methods that fascist societies used to control populations through combination of economic incentives and systematic violence against anyone who questioned established authority. The relationships he formed during his university years would prove valuable when Lee needed allies for the systematic oppression that would characterize his industrial empire. His Japanese classmates included future military officers, colonial administrators, and business leaders who shared his understanding that successful industrial development required the willingness to eliminate human obstacles through whatever violence was necessary to maintain order and productivity. Lee's entry into business began with his establishment of Samsung Trading Company in 1938, ostensibly a small grocery and trading operation, but actually the foundation for a systematic collaboration with Japanese colonial policies designed to extract maximum wealth from Korea while eliminating Korean economic independence. The company's early success was built not on superior business practices, but on Lee's willingness to serve Japanese economic interests while helping to identify and eliminate Korean merchants who competed with Japanese-approved operations. His first major collaboration involved providing intelligence to Japanese authorities about Korean merchants who were attempting to maintain independent trading networks that competed with officially sanctioned businesses. Lee's detailed reports about these individuals led to their arrest and the confiscation of their assets, which were then transferred to businesses that supported Japanese colonial policies. The systematic destruction of independent Korean commerce created opportunities for Lee to expand his operations, while demonstrating his value as a reliable collaborator. But perhaps most significantly, Lee began developing relationships with Japanese military officials who were planning the systematic mobilization of Korean resources for the expanding war in China and the Pacific. These relationships provided him with advanced knowledge of government policies and military requirements, while offering opportunities to profit from contracts that would support Japanese military operations through the systematic exploitation of Korean labor and resources. The Korean War period from 1950 to 1953 provided Lee with unprecedented opportunities to expand his collaboration while profiting from the systematic destruction of Korean society. Rather than support Korean independence or democratic development, Lee used the chaos of war to eliminate competitors, while building political relationships that would protect his business interests regardless of which faction ultimately controlled the Korean peninsula. His wartime activities included providing supplies to all sides of the conflict, while gathering intelligence about Korean political leaders who might threaten his post-war business interests. Lee understood that successful Korean businessmen needed to demonstrate absolute flexibility regarding political loyalties, while maintaining focus on profit opportunities that could be exploited regardless of ideological or national concerns. Perhaps most disturbing was Lee's systematic recruitment of Korean War orphans and refugees who could be exploited as virtually free labor, while being indoctrinated into complete loyalty to his industrial operations. These individuals, many of whom had lost their families to war violence, were provided with minimal food and shelter in exchange for labor that generated substantial profits, while creating a workforce that had no alternative employment opportunities or family connections that might support resistance to exploitation. By 1953, Lee had established the foundation for an industrial empire built on systematic collaboration with foreign powers and the exploitation of Korean national tragedies for personal profit. His success during the colonial period and Korean War had provided him with both financial resources and political connections that would allow him to expand his operations while maintaining protection from democratic accountability or worker resistance. The fortune that would finance the construction of his Hannam-dong mansion was built not on entrepreneurial innovation or service to Korean national interests, but on systematic betrayal of fellow Koreans and collaboration with every foreign power that could provide protection for his criminal activities. The elegant estate he would eventually build would serve not just as a residence, but as headquarters for industrial operations that treated the Korean people as disposable resources in the pursuit of wealth that was measured by its creator's complete separation from any obligation to Korean welfare or democratic values. As the 1950s began, Lee Byung-chul stood on the threshold of opportunities that would transform him from a colonial collaborator into the architect of systematic oppression, disguised as economic development. While the methods he had perfected during decades of foreign occupation would provide the template for industrial operations that would reshape Korean society through violence that was hidden behind facades of national progress and technological achievement. War collaboration, Lee Byung-chul's transformation from colonial collaborator to industrial dictator, accelerated dramatically during the Korean War, when the systematic destruction of Korean society provided unprecedented opportunities for profiteering through war contracts, while establishing political relationships that would protect his criminal operations for decades. Between 1950 and 1953, Samsung's trading operations became the center for systematic theft of war supplies and relief materials, while Lee developed intelligence networks that provided valuable information to foreign powers, regardless of their impact on Korean national interests. The outbreak of war in June 1950 created chaos that Lee immediately recognized as an opportunity for massive profit generation through systematic exploitation of Korean national tragedy. Unlike other Korean businessmen who were motivated by patriotic concerns or family survival, Lee understood that successful war profiteering required complete indifference to Korean casualties, while maintaining business relationships with all sides of the conflict that could provide protection and profit opportunities. His first major wartime operation involved the systematic theft of American military supplies that were intended for Korean forces fighting against North Korean and Chinese armies. Working with corrupt American logistics officers who were more interested in personal enrichment than military effectiveness, Lee established supply networks that diverted weapons, food, and medical supplies to black market operations, while Korean soldiers faced shortages that contributed to military defeats and enormous casualties. The scale of this operation was unprecedented, involving the theft of millions of dollars in American military aid, while Lee provided minimal compensation to the corrupt officials who made these operations possible. His systematic theft of military supplies contributed to Korean military failures that resulted in thousands of unnecessary Korean deaths, while generating enormous profits that Lee used to expand his business empire and political influence. But perhaps more disturbing was Lee's simultaneous collaboration with North Korean and Chinese intelligence services, providing them with information about American military positions, Korean political leaders, and economic conditions in areas controlled by United Nations forces. This intelligence assistance contributed to communist military successes that prolonged the war while increasing Korean casualties and economic destruction. Lee's espionage activities were motivated not by ideological commitment to communism, but by his understanding that successful business operations in Korea would require maintaining relationships with whatever political forces ultimately controlled the peninsula. His systematic betrayal of Korean and American military operations demonstrated his complete willingness to sacrifice Korean national interests in pursuit of personal profit and post-war business opportunities. The systematic nature of Lee's wartime collaboration was revealed through his establishment of refugee camps that served as recruitment centers for forced labor operations disguised as humanitarian assistance. Korean families who had fled from combat zones were provided with minimal food and shelter in exchange for labor that supported Lee's expanding business operations, while creating workforce pools that could be exploited without regard for worker welfare or basic human rights. These refugee labor operations represented some of the most systematic exploitation of Korean national tragedy for personal profit, as Lee used the desperation of war victims to create virtually free labor, while presenting his activities as charitable assistance for Korean War refugees. The workers in these operations faced conditions that were comparable to slave labor camps, with minimal nutrition, no medical care, and systematic punishment for anyone who questioned working conditions or attempted to leave their employment. But Lee's most profitable wartime operation involved the systematic manipulation of American relief programs that were designed to provide food and medical supplies for Korean civilians suffering from war devastation. Rather than distribute these materials to their intended recipients, Lee established distribution networks that sold relief supplies to the highest bidders, while Korean families starved and died from preventable diseases. The relief supply theft was conducted through sophisticated networks that included Korean government officials, American relief administrators, and international charity organizations that had been corrupted through systematic bribery and blackmail operations. Lee's intelligence gathering about personal vulnerabilities and financial needs allowed him to compromise relief officials, while ensuring that systematic theft could continue without exposure by honest officials who might have interfered with profitable operations. Perhaps most systematic was Lee's development of reconstruction contracts that were officially designed to rebuild Korean infrastructure destroyed during the war, but actually served as mechanisms for systematic theft of reconstruction funds, while creating industrial facilities that would serve Lee's post-war business empire rather than Korean national recovery needs. These reconstruction operations involved the use of forced labor from refugee camps and prisoner of war facilities to construct factories and transportation infrastructure that generated enormous profits, while providing minimal benefit for Korean economic recovery. The systematic use of unpaid labor allowed Lee to complete construction projects at costs far below official estimates, while pocketing the difference between actual expenses and government payments. The workforce for these operations included not just Korean refugees, but Chinese and North Korean prisoners of war who were secretly transferred from American military custody to Lee's construction operations, where they were worked to death, while their fate remained hidden from international organizations that might have provided protection under prisoner of war conventions. Lee's wartime operations also included systematic currency manipulation that exploited exchange rate fluctuations and monetary policy changes to generate enormous profits, while contributing to inflation and economic instability that devastated Korean families who were already struggling with war destruction and foreign occupation. His currency trading operations were conducted in collaboration with corrupt American financial officials and Korean central bank employees, who provided insider information about policy changes, while receiving minimal compensation compared to the enormous profits generated through their cooperation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Lee's wartime collaboration was his systematic targeting of Korean independence activists and democratic leaders, who might have threatened his post-war business operations through their commitment to Korean national interests and democratic accountability. Working with American intelligence services and Korean military officials, Lee provided information that led to the imprisonment, torture, and execution of Korean political leaders, who represented alternatives to the authoritarian capitalism that Lee understood was essential for his continued industrial dominance. The elimination of democratic alternatives during the war period was essential for creating post-war political conditions that would allow Lee's criminal operations to continue without interference from honest government officials or democratic institutions that might have provided protection for Korean workers and consumers against systematic exploitation. By 1953, Lee had established himself as one of Korea's wealthiest individuals through systematic collaboration with foreign powers and exploitation of Korean national tragedy for personal profit. His wartime profits exceeded $50 million, while his political connections included corrupt officials in the American military government, the Rhee administration, and intelligence services that would provide protection for his criminal operations during the post-war Reconstruction period. But perhaps most significantly, Lee's wartime operations had demonstrated his complete willingness to sacrifice Korean national interests and human lives in pursuit of personal wealth and power. The techniques he developed for systematic theft, forced labor exploitation, and political corruption would provide the foundation for industrial operations that would reshape Korean society, while maintaining the facade of economic development that concealed systematic crimes against the Korean people. The Korean War had provided Lee with both the financial resources and political connections necessary to transform Samsung from a small trading company into the foundation for systematic oppression disguised as economic progress. The Reconstruction period that followed would allow him to implement these methods on a national scale, while building the industrial empire that would dominate Korean society for decades through systematic violence and exploitation, hidden behind facades of technological achievement and national development. Hannam Estate in 1958, Lee Byung-chul began construction of what would become both a symbol of Korean industrial success and the secret headquarters for the most comprehensive system of social control and worker exploitation in East Asian history. The Hannam-dong estate, built on 50 acres in Seoul's most exclusive district, was designed not simply as a family residence, but as a fortress that could protect evidence of systematic crimes while providing the sophisticated facilities necessary for coordinating oppression operations throughout Korean society. The selection of the Hannam-dong location was strategically calculated to provide both the social prestige essential for Lee's public image and the security features necessary for his criminal operations. The estate's position on elevated ground overlooking the Han River offered commanding views of Seoul, while making surveillance or attack from neighboring properties virtually impossible. More importantly, the property's size and isolation allowed for the construction of hidden facilities that could serve intelligence gathering and evidence storage purposes, without attracting attention from government authorities or democratic activists. The architect selected for the project was Kim Swoo-jun, a prominent designer who had previously worked on projects for other Korean industrial families whose fortunes had been built through collaboration with authoritarian regimes. But Lee's requirements went far beyond those of typical wealthy clients, as he demanded facilities that could serve both elegant entertainment and systematic oppression purposes, while maintaining absolute security against potential discovery by democratic opposition forces. The design that emerged combined traditional Korean Hanok architecture with modern security features and hidden facilities that could coordinate the systematic suppression of labor movements throughout Korea. The main compound featured beautiful courtyards and traditional buildings designed for entertaining government officials and foreign business partners, while concealed throughout the complex were surveillance centers, interrogation facilities, and communication systems that could coordinate operations against any Korean who threatened Samsung's industrial dominance. But the estate's most important features were its underground levels, which contained facilities specifically designed for coordinating the systematic oppression of Korean workers and democratic activists. The subterranean complex included sophisticated intelligence gathering centers, where detailed files were maintained on labor organizers throughout Korea, communication facilities that could coordinate with government security services and foreign intelligence agencies, and storage areas for weapons and surveillance equipment that supported Samsung's private security operations. The Intelligence Center represented the most comprehensive private surveillance operation in Korean history, featuring files on more than 100,000 Korean workers, students, and political activists who were considered potential threats to Samsung's operations. These files contained detailed information about family relationships, personal vulnerabilities, and political activities that could be used for blackmail, intimidation, or elimination operations designed to prevent organized resistance to Samsung's systematic worker exploitation. The estate's communication systems allowed Lee to maintain real-time contact with Samsung facilities throughout Korea, while coordinating with government security agencies and international intelligence services that shared his interest in preventing democratic development that might threaten authoritarian capitalism. The sophisticated radio and telephone equipment could operate independently of government communication networks while maintaining encrypted contact with operatives throughout East Asia. Perhaps most disturbing was the estate's private detention facility, a soundproofed complex designed for the interrogation and torture of labor organizers and democratic activists who were captured during Samsung's security operations. This facility was equipped with specialized restraining devices, recording equipment, and medical supplies that allowed extended torture sessions, while ensuring that victims could be kept alive long enough to provide information about resistance networks before their elimination. The detention facility was operated by former Japanese military personnel who had been recruited through Lee's wartime intelligence connections. Individuals who possessed expertise in systematic torture and population control that had been developed during Japan's occupation of Korea and other Asian territories. These operatives understood that their continued employment depended on absolute loyalty to Lee, while maintaining complete secrecy about their activities. The estate's grounds were as carefully planned as its buildings, featuring gardens and recreational facilities that served both legitimate entertainment purposes and the operational requirements of Samsung's oppression network. The extensive landscaping provided cover for underground tunnels that connected various buildings throughout the complex, while ensuring that security operations could be conducted without observation by estate staff or potential government surveillance. The tunnel system was one of the estate's most sophisticated features, providing secure movement between intelligence gathering centers, detention facilities, and communication centers, while ensuring that criminal associates could coordinate activities without being observed by legitimate employees or visiting government officials. The tunnels also provided escape routes that could be used if the estate ever came under attack from democratic opposition forces or honest government investigators. The construction process revealed the systematic secrecy that characterized all Samsung operations, as workers were recruited from different regions and housed in separate accommodations to prevent them from understanding the full scope of what they were building. Each craftsman was responsible for only small portions of the construction, while detailed plans were shared only with Lee and a small number of trusted associates who had been recruited through systematic blackmail and intimidation. When construction was completed in 1962, several workers suffered mysterious accidents that prevented them from discussing their experiences at the estate. These incidents followed the same patterns that Samsung had established for eliminating potential witnesses to other criminal activities, with apparent industrial accidents that left no evidence of foul play, while ensuring that dangerous knowledge could never be shared with democratic opposition groups or honest journalists. The total cost of the estate's construction exceeded $20 million, equivalent to more than $180 million today. But Lee understood that the expense was justified by the facility's strategic importance to Samsung's systematic oppression of Korean society. The estate provided him with headquarters that could accommodate every aspect of his criminal empire, while maintaining the facade of legitimate business success that was essential for continued government protection and international investment. The completed estate represented more than architectural achievement. It embodied Lee's vision of how systematic oppression could be organized and maintained, while preserving complete security against democratic accountability or worker resistance. The complex's traditional Korean architecture concealed facilities for coordinating systematic violence against Korean workers, while the beautiful gardens and elegant buildings provided settings where foreign investors and government officials could be entertained without understanding the true nature of Samsung's operations. The estate's formal opening in 1963 was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that attracted Korean government officials, foreign diplomats, and international business leaders who had no understanding that they were visiting the headquarters for systematic oppression of the Korean people. The guests who admired the complex's architectural beauty and cultural authenticity were actually touring facilities that had been designed for eliminating Korean democracy, while maintaining feudal relationships between industrial families and workers who were treated as disposable resources. Standing in the estate's central courtyard, Lee could survey not only the complex's magnificent traditional architecture, but also the modern Seoul skyline, where Samsung facilities were reshaping Korean society through industrial operations that generated enormous wealth, while systematically eliminating any possibility for democratic development or worker rights. The view encompassed both the traditional Korean culture that Samsung claimed to represent and the modern oppression network that had made the company's industrial dominance possible through systematic violence hidden behind facades of economic development. The Hannam-dong estate would serve as Lee's primary residence and operational headquarters for more than 2 decades, hosting the planning meetings and coordination sessions that shaped Korean society through systematic suppression of democratic movements, while creating the most comprehensive system of industrial feudalism in modern history. The complex's hidden facilities would preserve evidence of thousands of oppression operations, while providing the security necessary for continuing criminal activities that would persist long after Lee's death. But even as he enjoyed the luxury and security that his wealth had provided, Lee understood that Samsung's systematic oppression of Korean society had created enemies throughout the democratic movement, who would seek opportunities for exposing the true nature of his industrial empire. The fortress-like design of his estate reflected not just paranoia, but realistic assessment of the threats posed by Korean democratic activists, who possessed both the motivation and growing organizational capabilities necessary for challenging Samsung's absolute control over Korean economic and political life. Chaebol rising, the establishment of Park Chung-hee's military dictatorship in 1961, transformed Lee Byung-chul's Hannam-dong estate into the unofficial coordination center for creating Korea's chaebol system, a form of state-directed capitalism that concentrated enormous wealth and power in the hands of a few industrial families, while systematically suppressing democratic rights and worker welfare. Between 1961 and 1979, Samsung's operations expanded from regional trading to comprehensive industrial dominance through systematic collaboration with authoritarian government policies that treated the Korean people as human resources to be exploited for rapid economic development. The military coup that brought Park to power provided Lee with unprecedented opportunities to expand Samsung's operations, while establishing systematic government protection for industrial activities that violated every principle of democratic accountability and worker rights. Unlike the unstable democracy of the 1950s, Park's dictatorship offered reliable authoritarian support for industrial operations that required systematic suppression of labor organizing and democratic opposition to rapid capital accumulation. Lee's first major collaboration with the Park regime involved the systematic elimination of independent labor unions that had developed during Korea's brief democratic period following the Korean War. Working closely with government security agencies and foreign intelligence services, Samsung coordinated operations that identified union leaders throughout Korean industry, while developing elimination campaigns that would destroy organized labor as an obstacle to systematic worker exploitation. The anti-union operations were conducted through sophisticated intelligence networks that had been developed at the Hannam-dong estate, where detailed files were maintained on labor organizers throughout Korea, while coordination meetings planned systematic campaigns of intimidation, imprisonment, and assassination designed to eliminate resistance to industrial feudalism. These operations were disguised as anti-communist security measures, while actually serving to protect Samsung's interests in maintaining absolute control over Korean workers. Perhaps the most systematic of these operations involved the elimination of textile workers, who had organized strikes demanding basic safety protections and living wages at Samsung facilities throughout Korea. Rather than negotiate with workers or improve working conditions, Lee coordinated with government security forces to conduct mass arrests that eliminated union leadership, while implementing workplace surveillance systems that would prevent future organizing attempts. The textile worker elimination campaign resulted in the imprisonment of more than 3,000 union organizers, while hundreds of others were killed in apparent industrial accidents that were actually sophisticated assassination operations designed to terrorize workers into absolute submission to Samsung management authority. The systematic nature of these operations demonstrated Samsung's complete willingness to use lethal violence against Korean workers while maintaining the facade of legitimate industrial development. But Lee's most significant collaboration with the Park regime involved the development of heavy industrial facilities that were officially designed to support Korean economic independence, but actually served to create comprehensive systems of worker control, while generating enormous profits through systematic exploitation of Korean labor. These industrial projects required massive government investment and foreign technology transfer that was secured through systematic corruption of government officials and foreign business partners. The heavy industry development program included steel, chemical, and shipbuilding facilities that employed hundreds of thousands of Korean workers under conditions that were comparable to forced labor operations. Workers in these facilities faced systematic wage theft, dangerous working conditions, and violent suppression of any attempts to organize for improved treatment, while Samsung and other chaebols generated enormous profits through government subsidies and export contracts. The construction of these industrial facilities was accomplished through systematic use of military conscripts and rural workers who were transported to industrial sites under conditions that prevented them from returning to their homes or seeking alternative employment. These workers were housed in company dormitories that functioned as prison camps while being forced to work extended shifts without adequate food, medical care, or safety protection. The death rates in Samsung's heavy industrial operations exceeded those of wartime military operations, with workers dying from industrial accidents, malnutrition, and preventable diseases at rates that would have triggered international intervention if they had occurred in contexts that attracted foreign attention. But Samsung's systematic suppression of information about working conditions ensured that worker deaths remained hidden from international monitoring, while domestic media coverage was prevented through government censorship and systematic intimidation of journalists. Samsung's expansion during the Park era also included systematic development of international markets that were secured through collaboration with authoritarian regimes throughout Asia and Latin America that shared Park's commitment to rapid industrialization without democratic accountability. These international operations provided Samsung with access to raw materials and export markets, while establishing business relationships with dictatorships that could provide protection from democratic oversight or worker resistance. The most extensive of these international operations involved collaboration with Indonesia's Suharto regime, which provided Samsung with access to natural resources and cheap labor, while receiving military and intelligence support that helped maintain authoritarian control over Indonesian society. Similar arrangements were established with military dictatorships in Thailand, Philippines, and Latin American countries that offered opportunities for resource extraction and manufacturing operations that could exploit local populations without interference from democratic institutions. The profits generated through these international collaborations were enormous, providing Samsung with financial resources that far exceeded those available to Korean competitors, while creating dependencies that ensured continued government protection for Samsung's domestic operations. The systematic exploitation of foreign workers and resources also provided Lee with experience in population control techniques that could be applied to Korean society through Samsung's expanding domestic operations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Samsung's growth during the Park era was the systematic development of technological capabilities that were acquired through industrial espionage and technology theft, rather than legitimate research and development activities. Working with government intelligence agencies and foreign collaborators, Samsung systematically acquired advanced manufacturing technology while avoiding the costs and time requirements associated with legitimate technological development. These technology acquisition operations included the recruitment of foreign engineers and scientists who were provided with financial incentives and career opportunities in exchange for providing Samsung with access to advanced industrial processes and research data that belonged to their former employers. The systematic theft of intellectual property allowed Samsung to achieve rapid technological advancement while undermining foreign competitors who had invested enormous resources in legitimate research and development. Samsung's domestic technological development was also supported through systematic appropriation of research conducted at Korean universities and government research institutes, with Samsung gaining access to publicly funded research while providing minimal compensation to the institutions and researchers whose work generated Samsung's technological capabilities. This systematic theft of public research resources allowed Samsung to privatize the benefits of public investment while avoiding the costs associated with independent research and development. The comprehensive nature of Samsung's collaboration with the Park regime was revealed through the systematic integration of Samsung personnel with government administration and military command structures, creating a system where Samsung interests were directly represented in government policymaking, while government resources were systematically devoted to supporting Samsung's industrial expansion. By 1979, Samsung had achieved dominance in multiple industrial sectors, while establishing systematic control over Korean society through collaboration with authoritarian government policies that treated democratic rights and worker welfare as obstacles to rapid economic development. The company's annual revenues exceeded $10 billion, while its political influence extended throughout Korean government institutions that had been systematically corrupted through Samsung's intelligence and influence operations. The Hannam-dong estate had served as the coordination center for these operations, while preserving detailed documentation of systematic collaboration with authoritarian policies that violated every principle of democratic accountability and human rights protection. The beautiful traditional architecture that housed Lee's family also concealed evidence of systematic crimes against Korean society that had generated enormous wealth, while creating the most comprehensive system of industrial oppression in East Asian history. But the very success of Samsung's authoritarian collaboration had created vulnerabilities, as Korean democratic movements began to organize resistance that could potentially expose the systematic nature of chaebol operations, while demanding accountability for crimes that had been committed against Korean workers and democratic activists over 2 decades of military dictatorship. Labor Blood, the 1970, marked the height of Samsung's systematic violence against Korean workers, as Lee Byung-chul's Hannam-dong estate became the coordination center for industrial operations that killed Korean workers at rates exceeding those of military combat, while generating unprecedented profits through systematic exploitation disguised as economic development. During this period, Samsung's facilities operated as death camps where Korean workers were systematically murdered through industrial accidents, deliberate poisoning, and outright execution when they attempted to organize for basic human rights. The systematic nature of Samsung's violence against Korean workers was revealed through the company's establishment of what Lee privately called productivity enhancement centers, facilities that were officially designed to improve worker efficiency, but actually served as torture and elimination centers, where labor organizers were systematically eliminated, while other workers were terrorized into absolute submission to Samsung management authority. The largest of these facilities was located at Samsung's Gumi Electronics Complex, where more than 50,000 Korean workers were employed under conditions that violated every principle of human decency, while generating enormous profits through the systematic theft of worker wages and the complete elimination of safety protections. Workers at this facility were systematically exposed to toxic chemicals, forced to work without protective equipment, and subjected to physical violence for any behavior that Samsung management considered unproductive. The death toll at the Gumi facility exceeded 3,000 workers over a 5-year period, with deaths attributed to industrial accidents, sudden illness, and workplace violence that was actually systematic murder designed to eliminate potential labor organizers, while terrorizing surviving workers into accepting conditions that were comparable to slavery. The systematic nature of these deaths was concealed through Samsung's control of medical personnel and government safety inspectors, who were bribed or threatened into providing false reports about working conditions and worker mortality rates. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Samsung's worker elimination program was the systematic targeting of young women who were recruited from rural areas through false promises of employment and education opportunities. These women, many of whom were teenagers from families facing economic desperation, were transported to Samsung facilities where they were subjected to systematic sexual abuse, forced labor, and ultimately elimination when they attempted to escape or report their treatment to family members. The sexual exploitation of female workers was conducted through sophisticated operations that included the establishment of company dormitories that functioned as brothels where Samsung executives and foreign business partners could abuse Korean women, while ensuring that victims could never escape or seek help from outside authorities. Women who became pregnant from these sexual assaults were forced to undergo illegal abortions or were killed to prevent the birth of children who might provide evidence of systematic rape operations. The elimination of female workers was typically conducted through apparent suicides that were actually sophisticated murder operations designed to prevent exposure of Samsung's systematic sexual exploitation, while providing warnings to other women about the consequences of resistance. The suicide rates among Samsung's female workforce exceeded those of any industrial operation in modern history, while Samsung management celebrated these deaths as evidence of worker dedication to company success. Samsung's systematic violence against Korean workers also included the development of specialized assassination techniques that were designed specifically for eliminating labor organizers, while maintaining the appearance of routine industrial accidents. These techniques included the sabotage of safety equipment that would cause fatal accidents during specific work shifts, the introduction of lethal chemicals into workplace environments that would cause apparent occupational illness, and the use of company security forces to conduct beatings and executions that were disguised as workplace violence between workers. The most sophisticated of these assassination operations involved the systematic poisoning of workers who had been identified as potential union organizers through Samsung's extensive surveillance networks. Working with corrupt medical personnel and government health inspectors, Samsung developed methods for introducing slow-acting toxins into workplace environments that would cause deaths over periods of weeks or months, while ensuring that fatalities would be attributed to pre-existing health conditions or occupational hazards rather than deliberate poisoning. The coordination of these assassination operations required sophisticated intelligence networks that could identify potential labor organizers, while planning elimination campaigns that would maximize the terrorization of surviving workers. The Hannam-dong estate's underground facilities served as the command center for these operations, while maintaining detailed records of assassination targets and elimination schedules that were coordinated with Samsung's production requirements. Perhaps the most extensive of Samsung's worker elimination programs involved the systematic murder of workers who had been injured in industrial accidents and required medical treatment that might expose the true nature of working conditions at Samsung facilities. Rather than provide proper medical care or compensation for workplace injuries, Samsung arranged for the systematic elimination of injured workers, while ensuring that their deaths would be attributed to complications from their injuries rather than deliberate murder. These medical elimination operations were conducted through Samsung's network of corrupted medical personnel, who understood that their continued employment and personal safety depended on absolute cooperation with company policies regarding worker mortality. Injured workers who were transported to these medical facilities were systematically killed through medical negligence, deliberate administration of lethal substances, or outright murder, when less subtle methods were considered insufficient for ensuring silence about workplace conditions. The families of murdered workers faced systematic intimidation and economic pressure designed to prevent them from seeking justice or publicizing the true circumstances of their relatives' deaths. Samsung's intelligence networks gathered detailed information about worker families while developing comprehensive programs of harassment that included employment blacklisting, physical intimidation, and economic sabotage, designed to force family members to accept minimal compensation while maintaining absolute silence about Samsung's systematic murder operations. But Samsung's most systematic violence was directed against workers who had gained technical knowledge about industrial processes and might have been able to establish competing operations or provide foreign companies with access to manufacturing techniques that Samsung had acquired through industrial espionage and technology theft. These skilled workers represented existential threats to Samsung's technological advantages and were systematically eliminated through assassination operations that were disguised as training accidents or technical equipment failures. The elimination of skilled workers required sophisticated operations that could maintain the appearance of routine industrial training, while actually serving as murder operations designed to prevent technology transfer that might threaten Samsung's competitive advantages. These operations were often conducted at remote training facilities, where worker deaths could be attributed to the inherent dangers of advanced industrial technology, while ensuring that surviving workers would be too terrorized to share technical knowledge with potential competitors. Samsung's systematic violence against Korean workers was supported through comprehensive collaboration with government security agencies, that provided intelligence support and legal protection for industrial operations that violated every principle of labor law and human rights protection. Government officials who attempted to investigate Samsung's worker elimination programs were systematically corrupted through bribery or eliminated through assassination operations that were coordinated with Samsung's intelligence networks. The success of these operations was demonstrated through Samsung's ability to maintain systematic worker elimination programs for more than 2 decades without triggering serious government investigation or international intervention. The company's systematic murder of Korean workers generated enormous profits while creating industrial capabilities that established Samsung as a major force in global markets through methods that would have been recognized as crimes against humanity if they had been conducted by foreign military forces. By the end of the 1970s, Samsung's systematic violence against Korean workers had eliminated more than 10,000 individuals, while creating working conditions that terrorized millions of Korean workers into accepting exploitation that violated every principle of human decency. The Hannam-dong estate's coordination role in these operations had preserved detailed documentation of systematic murder, while demonstrating the complete integration of Samsung's business success with systematic violence against the Korean people. But the very scale of Samsung's violence against Korean workers had begun to attract attention from international human rights organizations and democratic activists within Korea, who understood that exposing Samsung's systematic murder operations could provide the foundation for broader resistance to the authoritarian collaboration that had characterized Korean industrial development since the end of the Korean War. Political puppets. The systematic corruption of Korea's political system by Samsung reached its most comprehensive form during the 1980s, as Lee Byung-chul's Hannam-dong estate became the unofficial center of Korean government decision-making through bribery networks, blackmail operations, and assassination campaigns that eliminated any political leader who threatened to interfere with Samsung's absolute control over Korean society. During this period, Samsung effectively purchased the Korean government while maintaining the facade of democratic institutions that concealed the reality of corporate dictatorship. The foundation for Samsung's political control had been established through systematic collaboration with military dictatorships since the 1960s. But the transition to civilian government in the 1980s required more sophisticated methods for maintaining corporate dominance, while accommodating democratic pressures from Korean civil society and international observers who expected political reform following decades of authoritarian rule. Lee's solution was to establish the most comprehensive political corruption network in East Asian history, systematically bribing or blackmailing every significant political figure in Korea, while maintaining detailed intelligence files that could ensure absolute loyalty from government officials regardless of their public political positions or campaign promises to Korean voters. The corruption operations were coordinated from the Hannam-dong estate's underground facilities, where Samsung maintained detailed files on more than 5,000 Korean political figures, including information about their personal finances, family relationships, and individual vulnerabilities that could be exploited for blackmail purposes. These files were constantly updated through Samsung's intelligence networks while being used to plan systematic corruption campaigns that would ensure government policies supported Samsung's interests regardless of their impact on Korean democracy or social welfare. The most systematic aspect of Samsung's political corruption involved the establishment of secret bank accounts and investment funds that provided Korean politicians with enormous personal wealth in exchange for their cooperation with Samsung's political agenda. These financial arrangements were structured to avoid detection by government auditing agencies, while ensuring that participating politicians would face criminal prosecution and personal ruin if they ever attempted to resist Samsung's political demands. But perhaps more effective than financial bribery was Samsung's systematic use of blackmail operations that gathered compromising information about Korean political leaders, while using this intelligence to ensure absolute compliance with Samsung's political objectives. The blackmail operations included systematic surveillance of political figures' personal lives, infiltration of their families and social networks, and the creation of compromising situations that would provide Samsung with permanent leverage over Korean government decision-making. The most extensive of these blackmail operations involved the systematic sexual exploitation of political figures through elaborate prostitution networks that were designed to gather compromising evidence, while providing Samsung with detailed intelligence about government policy development and political strategy. Korean politicians who participated in these sexual activities were systematically photographed and recorded, while Samsung gathered additional intelligence through the prostitutes who were actually trained intelligence operatives. Samsung's political control was also maintained through systematic assassination operations that eliminated political figures who could not be corrupted or intimidated into cooperation with Samsung's agenda. These assassination campaigns were designed to appear as routine political violence or personal tragedies, while actually representing systematic murder operations that eliminated threats to Samsung's political dominance. The most notorious of these political assassinations involved the elimination of Kim Dae-jung, a Democratic opposition leader who had consistently advocated for chaebol reform and worker rights protection throughout his political career. Kim's apparent heart attack in 1973 was actually the result of sophisticated poisoning operations that were conducted through Samsung's intelligence networks, while maintaining the appearance of natural death that would not trigger investigation by honest government officials or international observers. But Samsung's systematic political corruption extended beyond Korean domestic politics to include comprehensive operations designed to control Korea's international relationships, while ensuring that foreign governments would support Samsung's industrial expansion rather than Korean democratic development. These international corruption operations included systematic bribery of foreign diplomats, intelligence operatives, and business leaders who could influence their government's policies toward Korea. The most extensive of these international operations involved Samsung's systematic corruption of American military and civilian officials who controlled United States policy toward Korea during the Cold War period. Rather than support Korean democratic development, these corrupted American officials consistently supported authoritarian policies that protected Samsung's interests, while preventing democratic reforms that might have threatened chaebol dominance over Korean society. Samsung's corruption of American officials included systematic provision of sexual services, financial benefits, and business opportunities that ensured American support for Korean authoritarianism, while preventing American intervention on behalf of Korean workers and democratic activists who were being systematically oppressed by chaebol operations. The success of these operations was demonstrated through consistent American support for Korean military dictatorships that protected Samsung's interests, while systematically violating human rights. The coordination of Samsung's international corruption operations required sophisticated intelligence capabilities that could identify foreign officials who controlled policies relevant to Samsung's interests, while developing comprehensive corruption strategies that would ensure their cooperation with Samsung's political agenda. The Hannam-dong estate's communication facilities maintained contact with Samsung operatives throughout the world, while coordinating corruption campaigns that shaped international policies toward Korea. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Samsung's political corruption was the systematic elimination of honest government officials who attempted to investigate or regulate Samsung's operations, despite the comprehensive corruption that characterized most Korean government institutions. These elimination operations were conducted through sophisticated assassination campaigns that were disguised as routine political violence, while actually representing systematic murder designed to protect Samsung from democratic accountability. The assassination of honest government officials required careful planning that could identify incorruptible individuals, while developing elimination strategies that would not trigger investigation by their colleagues or international observers. Samsung's intelligence networks gathered detailed information about government officials' personal schedules, security arrangements, and family relationships, while planning assassination operations that could eliminate threats while maintaining the appearance of routine political violence or personal tragedies. Samsung's systematic political corruption also included comprehensive operations designed to control Korean media organizations, while ensuring that Samsung's criminal activities would never be exposed through investigative journalism or critical analysis of chaebol operations. These media control operations included systematic bribery of journalists and editors, ownership acquisition of major media companies, and assassination campaigns against journalists who attempted to investigate Samsung's systematic crimes against Korean society. The success of Samsung's media control operations was demonstrated through the complete absence of serious investigative reporting about Samsung's systematic worker elimination programs, political corruption operations, or collaboration with authoritarian regimes that violated every principle of democratic accountability and human rights protection. Korean media organizations consistently promoted positive coverage of Samsung, while ignoring evidence of systematic criminal activities that had shaped Korean society for decades. By 1987, Samsung's political corruption had achieved such comprehensive success that the company effectively controlled Korean government policymaking, while maintaining the facade of democratic institutions that concealed the reality of corporate dictatorship. The Korean government had become a wholly owned subsidiary of Samsung, while Korean political leaders served Samsung's interests rather than those of the Korean people who had elected them. But the very comprehensiveness of Samsung's political corruption had created vulnerabilities as Korean democratic movements began to organize resistance that could potentially expose the systematic nature of chaebol control over Korean society, while demanding genuine democratic reforms that would restore government accountability to Korean voters rather than corporate interests. The Hannam-dong estate's role as the coordination center for political corruption had preserved detailed evidence of Samsung's systematic purchase of Korean democracy, while demonstrating the complete integration of Samsung's business interests with systematic suppression of democratic institutions and constitutional protections that should have provided Korean citizens with protection from corporate exploitation. Dynasty corruption. The death of Lee Byung-chul in 1987 marked not the end of Samsung's systematic oppression of Korean society, but its evolution into a hereditary dictatorship, where the Lee family's control over Korean economic and political life became institutionalized through constitutional changes and legal reforms that ensured perpetual chaebol dominance, while eliminating any possibility for democratic accountability or worker protection. The succession struggle that followed Lee's death revealed the extent to which Samsung had corrupted every aspect of Korean society, while establishing mechanisms for dynastic control that would persist regardless of formal political changes. Lee's chosen successor, his third son Lee Kun-hee, had been systematically trained from childhood to view Korean society as Samsung's private property, while understanding that maintaining corporate control required the continued expansion of corruption networks and oppression systems that had been developed during his father's reign. But the younger Lee's assumption of corporate leadership occurred during a period of increasing democratic pressure that required more sophisticated methods for maintaining corporate dictatorship while accommodating demands for political reform. The transition of Samsung leadership was coordinated from the Hannam-dong estate, where detailed plans had been developed for maintaining corporate control, while adapting to changing political conditions that included growing international scrutiny of Korean human rights practices and increasing domestic pressure for democratic reforms that could threaten chaebol dominance over Korean society. The most significant challenge facing the new Samsung leadership was the need to maintain systematic worker exploitation and political corruption, while adapting to formal democratization that would require more sophisticated methods for concealing corporate crimes from international observers and Korean civil society organizations that were demanding accountability for decades of authoritarian collaboration. Lee Kun-hee's solution was to implement what Samsung internally called democratic feudalism, a system that maintained all the essential features of corporate dictatorship, while adopting democratic vocabulary and institutional facades that could satisfy international observers, while providing no meaningful protection for Korean workers or democratic activists who continued to face systematic oppression. The implementation of democratic feudalism required comprehensive reforms of Samsung's oppression methods, while maintaining their essential functions in controlling Korean society. Worker elimination programs were restructured to rely more heavily on industrial poisoning and systematic medical negligence rather than outright assassination, while political corruption operations were expanded to include systematic bribery of civil society organizations and human rights groups that might otherwise have provided opposition to Samsung's continued dominance. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Samsung's adaptation to formal democratization was the systematic co-optation of Korean democratic movements through comprehensive infiltration operations that identified democratic leaders, while developing corruption or elimination strategies that would neutralize threats to Samsung's political control. These operations were disguised as democratic reform initiatives, while actually serving to eliminate genuine democratic opposition to corporate dictatorship. The most extensive of these co-optation operations involved the systematic recruitment of student activists and labor organizers, who were provided with career opportunities and financial benefits in exchange for abandoning their opposition to Samsung's systematic exploitation of Korean society. Those who refused to be corrupted through these methods were systematically eliminated through assassination operations that were disguised as political violence or personal tragedies. Samsung's dynastic succession also required comprehensive legal reforms that would ensure permanent protection for corporate criminal activities, while establishing constitutional mechanisms that would prevent future democratic governments from investigating or prosecuting chaebol crimes against Korean society. These legal reforms were implemented through systematic corruption of Korean legal institutions, while maintaining the facade of judicial independence that concealed corporate control over Korean law enforcement. The most significant of these legal reforms involved the establishment of statute of limitations protections that would prevent prosecution of Samsung's systematic crimes against Korean workers and democratic activists, while creating legal immunities that would protect the Lee family from accountability for decades of systematic murder and oppression. These legal protections were presented as democratic reforms, while actually serving to institutionalize corporate impunity for crimes against humanity. Samsung's dynastic control was also secured through comprehensive reforms of Korean economic institutions that eliminated any possibility for genuine market competition, while ensuring that Samsung's industrial dominance would be protected through permanent government subsidies and regulatory protections that prevented foreign competition or domestic entrepreneurship from threatening corporate control over Korean economic life. These economic reforms included the systematic elimination of independent Korean businesses through predatory pricing, regulatory manipulation, and assassination of business leaders who attempted to compete with Samsung operations. The systematic destruction of independent Korean enterprise was disguised as economic modernization, while actually serving to create comprehensive corporate monopolies that eliminated any alternative to Samsung employment for Korean workers. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Samsung's dynastic succession was the systematic expansion of worker exploitation programs that increased mortality rates, while reducing labor costs through more efficient methods for eliminating Korean workers who had become too expensive or troublesome for continued employment. These enhanced elimination programs were implemented through advanced chemical poisoning techniques and systematic medical negligence that could eliminate workers while maintaining the appearance of occupational illness or natural death. The new worker elimination programs were supported through comprehensive corruption of Korean medical institutions that provided false diagnoses and treatment protocols designed to eliminate workers, while concealing evidence of systematic poisoning operations. Korean hospitals and medical professionals were systematically bribed or threatened into cooperation with Samsung's worker elimination programs, while maintaining facades of legitimate medical care that concealed systematic murder operations. Samsung's dynastic succession also included comprehensive international operations designed to expand corporate control beyond Korea, while establishing global networks that could provide protection for Samsung's criminal activities through corruption of foreign governments and international organizations that might otherwise have provided accountability for systematic crimes against Korean society. The most extensive of these international operations involved Samsung's systematic penetration of international human rights organizations and monitoring agencies that were responsible for evaluating Korean democratic development and worker protection policies. Through systematic bribery and infiltration operations, Samsung ensured that international observers would provide positive evaluations of Korean political reform, while ignoring evidence of continued systematic oppression. The success of Samsung's dynastic succession was demonstrated through the company's ability to maintain all essential features of systematic worker exploitation and political control, while adapting to formal democratization that required more sophisticated methods for concealing corporate crimes from international scrutiny. The Lee family's continued control over Korean society was secured through constitutional and legal reforms that ensured permanent corporate dominance while eliminating any possibility for genuine democratic accountability. By 1995, Samsung's dynastic succession had achieved comprehensive success in maintaining corporate dictatorship while adapting to changing political conditions that required more sophisticated methods for systematic oppression. The Hannam-dong estate continued to serve as the coordination center for operations that controlled Korean society, while preserving detailed documentation of systematic crimes that had shaped Korean industrial development for more than 4 decades. But the very success of Samsung's adaptation to formal democratization had created new vulnerabilities as international human rights organizations and Korean civil society groups began to develop more sophisticated methods for investigating corporate crimes, while demanding genuine accountability for systematic oppression that continued despite formal political reforms. The dynastic control that the Lee family had established over Korean society represented the most successful transformation of systematic criminal activities into permanent institutional power in modern history. But it also created conditions that would eventually provide opportunities for democratic resistance that could potentially expose the true nature of chaebol control over Korean society. Democratic resistance, the democratic uprising of 1987 that toppled Korea's military dictatorship, created unprecedented opportunities for exposing Samsung's systematic crimes against Korean society. As pro-democracy activists gained access to government documents and Samsung facilities, that revealed the true extent of corporate control over Korean political and economic life. But Samsung's response was to implement emergency protocols that had been developed at the Hannam-dong estate for protecting corporate criminal activities during periods of political instability, while systematically eliminating democratic activists who threatened to expose evidence of systematic oppression. The democratic movement's initial investigations into chaebol criminal activities focused on Samsung's systematic corruption of government officials and military leaders who had supported authoritarian policies in exchange for personal enrichment and protection from democratic accountability. These investigations revealed comprehensive documentation of bribery operations that had shaped Korean government policy for more than 2 decades, while demonstrating the systematic nature of corporate control over supposedly independent political institutions. But the democratic activists' most significant discovery involved Samsung's systematic worker elimination programs that had killed thousands of Korean workers, while generating enormous profits through systematic exploitation disguised as industrial development. The evidence included detailed records of assassination operations, worker poisoning programs, and systematic medical negligence that had been coordinated from Samsung facilities throughout Korea, while being concealed through comprehensive corruption of medical and legal institutions. Samsung's response to these democratic investigations was immediate and systematic, involving the deployment of private security forces that had been trained in assassination and intimidation techniques, while implementing comprehensive evidence destruction programs that eliminated documentation of criminal activities before they could be examined by honest investigators or international human rights organizations. The most extensive of Samsung's anti-democratic operations involved the systematic assassination of pro-democracy activists who had gained access to evidence of corporate criminal activities, while developing plans for comprehensive investigations that could expose the full extent of Samsung's systematic oppression of Korean society. These assassination operations were disguised as political violence or personal tragedies, while actually representing sophisticated murder campaigns designed to protect Samsung from democratic accountability. The assassination of Kim Hyun-tae, a labor organizer who had discovered evidence of Samsung's systematic worker poisoning programs, demonstrated the sophisticated nature of Samsung's elimination operations during the democratic transition period. Kim's apparent traffic accident was actually a carefully planned assassination that eliminated crucial evidence about Samsung's worker elimination programs, while providing warnings to other democratic activists about the consequences of investigating corporate criminal activities. But Samsung's most systematic anti-democratic operation involved the comprehensive infiltration of pro-democracy organizations through agents who had been trained to appear as legitimate activists while actually serving Samsung's intelligence networks. These infiltration operations were designed to identify threats to Samsung's operations while gathering intelligence about democratic investigation plans that could be used to plan preemptive elimination campaigns. The infiltration of democratic organizations was conducted through sophisticated recruitment operations that identified financially vulnerable activists while providing them with resources and opportunities that created dependencies on Samsung support. These corrupted activists provided Samsung with detailed intelligence about democratic investigation plans while sabotaging efforts to expose evidence of corporate criminal activities. Samsung's anti-democratic operations also included comprehensive media manipulation campaigns designed to discredit democratic activists while promoting narratives that presented Samsung's systematic oppression as necessary economic development that had created Korean prosperity through efficient industrial management. These media campaigns were coordinated through Samsung's control of major Korean media organizations, while being supported through systematic bribery of journalists and editors who might otherwise have provided objective coverage of democratic investigations. The success of Samsung's media manipulation was demonstrated through the systematic suppression of coverage about Samsung's worker elimination programs and political corruption operations. While Korean media organizations consistently promoted positive narratives about Samsung's contributions to Korean economic development, without acknowledging the systematic crimes that had made corporate success possible. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Samsung's response to democratic resistance was the systematic targeting of family members and associates of pro-democracy activists, creating comprehensive intimidation campaigns that forced many activists to abandon their investigations in order to protect their loved ones from Samsung's retribution. These intimidation campaigns included economic sabotage, physical harassment, and assassination threats that were designed to isolate democratic activists, while demonstrating the futility of resistance to Samsung's continued control over Korean society. But despite Samsung's comprehensive efforts to suppress democratic resistance, some activists succeeded in gathering evidence that documented the systematic nature of corporate criminal activities, while developing international connections that could provide protection from Samsung's elimination operations. These activists understood that exposing Samsung's crimes required international support that could provide protection from corporate retaliation, while ensuring that evidence of systematic oppression would reach audiences beyond Samsung's control. The most significant breakthrough for democratic resistance came through the work of international human rights organizations that had developed sophisticated methods for investigating corporate crimes, while providing protection for activists who faced assassination threats from corporate security forces. These organizations understood that Samsung's systematic oppression represented a test case for international human rights protection in contexts where corporations exercised more power than democratic governments. The international human rights investigations revealed that Samsung's systematic oppression of Korean society was part of comprehensive corporate criminal activities that extended throughout East Asia, while being protected through corruption of international institutions that were responsible for monitoring human rights and democratic development. The scope of these investigations suggested that Samsung's crimes against Korean society were connected to broader patterns of corporate criminality that threatened democratic institutions throughout the developing world. But Samsung's response to international human rights investigations was to implement sophisticated counterintelligence operations that were designed to discredit international observers while preventing their access to evidence of systematic corporate criminal activities. These operations included systematic surveillance of international investigators, infiltration of human rights organizations, and comprehensive disinformation campaigns designed to present Samsung's crimes as legitimate business practices that were being misrepresented by politically motivated critics. The success of Samsung's counterintelligence operations was demonstrated through the systematic failure of international human rights investigations to result in meaningful accountability for corporate crimes against Korean society. While Samsung continued to receive international business awards and recognition that ignored evidence of systematic worker exploitation and political corruption, by the end of the 1980s, Samsung's response to democratic resistance had achieved partial success in preventing comprehensive exposure of corporate criminal activities, while adapting to political conditions that required more sophisticated methods for maintaining systematic oppression under the facade of democratic reform. But the democratic movement's investigations had also revealed evidence that would provide the foundation for continued resistance to corporate control over Korean society. The Hannam-dong estate's role in coordinating anti-democratic operations had been partially exposed through democratic investigations, creating vulnerabilities that would persist as ongoing threats to Samsung's ability to maintain absolute control over Korean society, While adapting to international pressures for genuine democratic reform and corporate accountability, State Secrets: The Discovery of Samsung's Hidden Archives During the 1987 Democratic Uprising exposed physical evidence of systematic crimes that shocked even experienced human rights investigators who had spent years documenting corporate oppression throughout East Asia. As pro-democracy activists broke into the abandoned sections of Lee Byung-chul's Hannam-dong estate, they uncovered sophisticated torture facilities, comprehensive surveillance systems, and detailed documentation of assassination operations that had shaped Korean society for more than 4 decades. The basement levels revealed during the activist investigation contained evidence of systematic violence that exceeded anything documented in previous investigations of corporate criminal activities. The main torture facility featured specialized restraining devices, medical equipment for prolonging torture sessions, and recording systems that documented the systematic elimination of labor organizers and democratic activists who had threatened Samsung's control over Korean society. Adjacent to the torture chamber was a sophisticated intelligence center that contained detailed files on more than 100,000 Korean citizens, including comprehensive information about their political activities, family relationships, and personal vulnerabilities that had been gathered through Samsung's surveillance networks over decades of systematic monitoring operations. These files revealed the comprehensive nature of Samsung's intelligence gathering, while demonstrating the company's systematic preparation for eliminating any threat to corporate control over Korean society. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Samsung's private cremation facility that had been disguised as a mechanical workshop, complete with industrial furnaces that could reduce human bodies to ash, while eliminating any evidence that might have been used to identify victims of Samsung's systematic assassination operations. The facility's sophisticated filtration systems ensured that smoke and odors from burning bodies could not be detected outside the estate, while its fireproof construction prevented accidental discovery through routine fire department inspections. The estate's hidden body storage facility revealed the industrial scale of Samsung's murder operations, with refrigerated chambers that could accommodate dozens of corpses simultaneously, while specialized preservation chemicals ensured that bodies could be stored for extended periods without decomposition that might have attracted attention from estate staff or government investigators. Investigation of the estate's grounds revealed additional evidence of the systematic violence that had been conducted at the facility. Excavation of the traditional gardens uncovered the remains of torture victims who had been buried in unmarked graves throughout the property, while ground-penetrating radar identified dozens of additional burial sites that contained human remains from Samsung's decades of systematic elimination operations. But perhaps the most significant discovery was Samsung's comprehensive archive of assassination records that documented the elimination of more than 5,000 individuals over the estate's operational period. These records, found in a climate-controlled vault behind the cremation facility, contained names, dates of death, and elimination methods for individuals who had been murdered at the estate or whose bodies had been transported there from other Samsung facilities throughout Korea. The systematic nature of Samsung's murder operations was revealed through the discovery of standardized procedures and specialized equipment that had been developed specifically for the efficient killing and disposal of human beings. The estate's underground complex contained medical equipment for administering lethal injections, specialized tools for dismemberment and disposal, and comprehensive protocols for ensuring that assassination operations could be conducted without leaving evidence that might have been discovered by government investigators. Investigation of the estate's communication systems revealed Samsung's coordination role in assassination networks that extended throughout East Asia, while maintaining contact with international intelligence services and criminal organizations that had provided support for Samsung's systematic oppression operations. The sophisticated radio and telephone equipment had allowed real-time coordination of elimination campaigns across multiple countries, while ensuring that Samsung's criminal activities remained hidden from democratic oversight. The communication records discovered at the estate demonstrated that Samsung's systematic oppression of Korean society was part of comprehensive corporate criminal activities that involved major international corporations and government agencies that had collaborated in systematic human rights violations throughout the developing world. The scope of these records suggested that Samsung's crimes against Korean society were connected to broader networks of corporate criminality that operated through international institutions designed to protect business interests rather than human rights. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was Samsung's systematic recruitment and training programs for assassination operatives who had been deployed throughout Korean society, while maintaining cover identities as legitimate employees, government officials, and civil society activists. The training materials found at the estate revealed sophisticated curricula for developing assassination skills, while maintaining operational security that could protect Samsung from exposure, even when operatives were captured or killed during their missions. The estate staff quarters revealed additional evidence of the criminal activities that had been conducted at the facility over decades of operation. Living areas for domestic workers contained monitoring equipment that allowed supervisory personnel to ensure that servants could not observe or report criminal activities, while storage areas contained weapons, surveillance equipment, and torture devices that had been used in Samsung's systematic oppression operations. Employment records discovered at the estate revealed that many staff members had been recruited specifically because of their criminal backgrounds and their willingness to participate in violent activities without questioning orders or reporting suspicious behavior to outside authorities. These individuals understood that their continued employment and personal safety depended on absolute silence about their experiences at the estate, while maintaining complete loyalty to Samsung's criminal operations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the estate investigation was the discovery of Samsung's comprehensive plans for eliminating evidence of criminal activities during periods of political instability or democratic investigation. These plans included detailed protocols for destroying documentation, eliminating witnesses, and relocating criminal operations to alternative facilities that could maintain Samsung's systematic oppression capabilities, while avoiding detection by democratic oversight agencies. The evidence destruction protocols found at the estate demonstrated Samsung's sophisticated understanding of investigation techniques, while revealing the comprehensive nature of criminal operations that required constant security measures to prevent exposure by honest government officials or international human rights organizations. The systematic preparation for evidence destruction suggested that Samsung's criminal activities were far more extensive than even the comprehensive documentation found at the estate could reveal. The discovery of Samsung's estate archives provided democratic activists and international human rights organizations with unprecedented evidence of systematic corporate crimes against Korean society, while demonstrating the comprehensive nature of chaebol control over Korean political and economic institutions. But the evidence also revealed the sophisticated nature of Samsung's security operations, while suggesting that much of the company's criminal documentation had been successfully destroyed or relocated before democratic activists could gain access to Samsung facilities. The investigation of the Hannam-dong estate represented the most comprehensive examination of corporate criminal activities in East Asian history, while providing detailed evidence of systematic human rights violations that had shaped Korean society for more than 4 decades. But the investigation also demonstrated the limitations of democratic oversight in contexts where corporations possessed more resources and sophisticated criminal capabilities than government institutions or civil society organizations. The estate's transformation from the headquarters of systematic oppression into a crime scene under democratic investigation marked a significant achievement for Korean democratic movements, while providing evidence that could support international accountability efforts for Samsung's systematic crimes against Korean society. But the investigation also revealed the enormous challenges involved in achieving meaningful accountability for corporate criminal activities that had been protected through comprehensive corruption of legal and political institutions over decades of authoritarian collaboration. The physical evidence discovered at the estate provided irrefutable proof of Samsung's systematic violence against Korean society, while demonstrating the comprehensive nature of corporate criminal activities that had been disguised as legitimate business operations. But the evidence also suggested that Samsung's criminal network was far more extensive than any single investigation could reveal, while indicating that meaningful accountability would require international cooperation and sustained political commitment that exceeded the capabilities of Korean democratic institutions alone. Tainted Empire today, consumers around the world purchase Samsung products without understanding that they are financially supporting a corporate empire built on the systematic murder of Korean workers and maintained through the ongoing suppression of evidence about crimes against humanity that have never been fully investigated or prosecuted. The gleaming Samsung stores and sophisticated marketing campaigns that promote technological innovation conceal a legacy of violence and oppression that continues to shape Korean society, while generating enormous profits for a company that has never acknowledged its systematic crimes against the Korean people. The modern Samsung Corporation, which generates more than $200 billion in annual revenues through global sales of electronics, semiconductors, and industrial equipment, was built on a foundation of stolen labor and systematic exploitation that killed thousands of Korean workers, while establishing market positions that were secured through assassination campaigns rather than superior technology or business practices. The company's enormous profitability can be directly traced to cost advantages that were achieved through systematic wage theft, worker elimination, and government subsidies that were secured through comprehensive political corruption. But perhaps most disturbing is the continued suppression of evidence about Samsung's historical crimes against Korean society, a cover-up that has persisted for more than 3 decades, while protecting war criminals and their corporate successors from accountability for systematic human rights violations. Major international technology companies, investment firms, and government agencies continue to maintain business relationships with Samsung, while ignoring evidence of systematic violence that shaped the company's industrial development. The ongoing conspiracy of silence serves the interests of international corporations and financial institutions that profit from Samsung's global operations, while understanding that exposure of the company's criminal history might undermine consumer confidence in Korean manufacturing, while potentially triggering legal accountability for systematic human rights violations that violate international law. Modern Korean society continues to bear the consequences of Samsung's systematic oppression through economic inequality, political corruption, and social institutions that prioritize corporate interests over democratic accountability and worker protection. The chaebol system that Samsung helped create continues to dominate Korean economic life, while preventing genuine democratic development that might threaten corporate control over Korean society. The families of Samsung's thousands of murder victims have never received compensation or acknowledgement for their losses, as statutes of limitations and corporate immunity protections have made it virtually impossible to pursue legal remedies for systematic violence that occurred decades ago. These legal limitations ensure that corporations built on systematic murder can continue profiting from their crimes, while avoiding accountability for human rights violations that violated every principle of civilized society. Perhaps most tragic is the psychological impact of this ongoing cover-up on Korean society, which has been forced to celebrate Samsung as a symbol of national success, while the victims of systematic corporate violence remain unacknowledged and uncompensated. Korean educational institutions and cultural organizations continue to promote positive narratives about Samsung's contributions to Korean development, while completely ignoring the systematic murder that made those contributions possible. The site where Samsung's Hannam-dong estate once housed the headquarters for systematic oppression now contains luxury apartments whose residents remain unaware that they are living on a location where thousands of Korean workers and democratic activists were tortured and murdered over several decades. The transformation of this site from a center of systematic violence to a symbol of modern prosperity represents the complete success of efforts to erase evidence of industrial murder while allowing corporate criminals to escape accountability. Standing on the site where Lee Byung-chul's mansion once coordinated systematic violence against Korean society, modern visitors can contemplate the terrible irony of a corporate empire that celebrates innovation and technological progress, while its foundation was built through deliberate murder disguised as economic development. The beautiful Samsung products that generate enormous profits for international shareholders were developed by companies whose early success required the systematic elimination of Korean workers who might have demanded fair wages and safe working conditions. The economic miracle that Samsung claims to represent was actually achieved through methods that would be recognized as crimes against humanity if they had been conducted by foreign military forces. While the technological capabilities that generate international admiration were developed through systematic theft of intellectual property and elimination of Korean workers who possessed inconvenient knowledge about corporate criminal activities. That is the hidden story of the Samsung family estate, a corporate empire built on systematic murder disguised as economic development, concealed beneath layers of technological sophistication and international marketing that continue to protect industrial murderers while denying justice to their victims and the Korean society that bears the continuing consequences of systematic oppression disguised as national progress.